Alrighty, so welcome to MySec Jackson. Woo! All right, and then without further ado, I'm just going to go right into the presentation. Give me a second here. And there you go.
Cool. Thank you, sir. Hello. Thank you for having me. My people I don't know well call me 8 Bear. I have a real name in the real world, but out of respect for my employer, I'm leaving it out. But yeah, this presentation is really something I've been developing for about a year now. Really should have given it at MySecCon. Really missed the ball there. But I was excited when Gondorth was cool with me presenting it here. And I love the local first attitude with MySecCon, with the different MySec chapters, of course. So here we go. Basically, this is a talk about cyber espionage. Should we chill for a second?
Technology, right?
Processing. You can keep talking in general. We play around with the
Cool. So, anyway, this is going to be a topic about cyber espionage, specifically attribution analysis. And I think before we even launch into this topic and continue troubleshooting these screen issues, I would mention there's far more ways than one to look at this. I don't think there's a universal truth on this issue. This is just my position. I try to evidence that based on open sources, things like that. But, if you're in the CTI world or you're even in the DFI world or something like that, or you just make use of cyber threat intelligence, you may have a different position on this. And I totally respect that. Cool. Thank you. I'm not going to read this abstract to you guys. This was sort of in the ad itself, but it sort of captures what I'm going to try to bring up. And it's essentially that, especially in a national security context, threat actor attribution, when it comes to espionage or just pure cyber warfare destructive style, is incredibly important. And in my opinion, not done rigorously enough in the commercial sector. There are different reasons for that. We'll sort of explore that. But ultimately, it's incredibly hard to do. It cannot be done with just telemetry and clustering and these different analytic methodologies. Those things are all good and fine. The kind of attribution I respect the most tends to involve a lot of inside knowledge of those espionage groups themselves, of frankly, their order of battle, frankly, what groups they belong to, what people make them up. All those things are super important. And it's really the combination of best practices and that insider knowledge, whether that comes from open source or closed source sources, that make up the best attribution, in my opinion. So quick background, we just kind of step through a background thesis that I'll sort of just touched on a minute ago. But then, why does attribution matter? What are some of the problematic industry conventions out there, at least as I see it? Complex realities behind espionage groups, and then some recommendations. Disclaimer, of course, I don't represent my employer. I don't represent the U.S. government anymore. These are strictly my opinions alone. I represent myself. My position, my perspective is really informed by my background. I started off in graduate school in an intelligence fusion center called the NCFTA, National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance in Pittsburgh. That's what got me into cybersecurity broadly. We were focused primarily on crimeware there, carding sites, things like that, ways to manipulate the online world for financial transactions, be they terrorists, be they criminal. some Chinese hacktivism as well. China really was my focus in graduate school. Their obsession at the time, this is circa 2007, with asymmetric warfare in particular, is really what got me into cyber warfare. It was really the application of destructive IT or IT as a medium for conducting espionage that interested me the most. So I'm actually a history major. I'm okay. I'm all right. You're okay. I'm okay. We're all okay. But I went on a technical track from there and got some other degrees and stuff. Ultimately was hired by the National Security Agency in a counterintelligence, sort of a technical counterintelligence capacity. Had formal training as an intelligence analyst. Went on to do counterintel work, but ultimately I really cut my teeth in government leading computer network exploitation operations. So being the espionage group conducting the attacks, if you will. Later on, forward deployed to the FBI here in Detroit. They had a cyber task force, and that's really when I got onto the defensive security side and got to study other threat groups rather than be the threat group to somebody else. But I think that perspective is important. I think what looks like magic on the outside, understandably so, is usually much more complex underneath it. And I think I have perspective from both. Recently, I was with Antigen Security with a number of excellent MySec people here that you probably know. And I continue to sort of dabble in the CTI space. I really liked deconstructing our DFIR cases, in this case, ransomware usually, and sort of teasing it apart, looking at it from a Tradecraft perspective. This is my background. We've kind of beat this thesis up already, but right now, and you'll see this among some of the most prominent vendors in the InfoSec space, very, very casual attribution analysis, and it drives me nuts. Again, I will acknowledge there's more than one way to look at this, and it's understandable because different people have different interests in attribution. You know what I mean? If you were a commercial entity, say outside of the national defense space, do you really care what the org structure of like 3PLA looks like? Probably not, right? That's okay. That's understandable. But from a government or national defense perspective, looking out, that attribution needs to be airtight. It needs to be down to the human level, certainly the human org level, in my opinion. And that tends to take classified intelligence. It doesn't exclusively, though. There are plenty of examples of cyber actors, espionage cyber actors over the years, self-attributing, against as some unit, you know what I mean? Some field post number, some VHA, if you follow the Russian threat at all. And usually they're military. They're not always, though, but sometimes people disclose too much, obviously, on the internet. That's been known to happen. Operators do that too. When people make that attribution and you can tie them to specific espionage actions sourced from a known espionage network, that's attribution too. It's just harder to come by, but it can be done. So why does it matter so much, at least as far as national defense goes? Really, attribution figures into a number of essential applications. You have things like diplomacy. You have things like actual national defense. You have, the government's burgeoning role or cooperation or partnership with the private sector. All these things are important, right? When a Russian military cyber group goes bananas and starts whacking like firewalls everywhere, people get mad because it affects the private sector, not just the government sector. Also, you have tons of examples of foreign policy decisions and information operations that it informs as well. Conflicts in certain places in Eurasia, say Ukraine and Russia. I mean, these are important things. Knowing who's doing what, especially when you're in a state of war, it's going to be exceptionally important. Also, but there are many risks that I think we need to be honest about. One, and I see this also in the CTI realm on the private side is a lot of circular reporting. Somebody reports something, somebody else reports that. It becomes two sources for the same happening, even though they're actually just mirror images of one another. That's dangerous. That can lead to all sorts of problems, whether they be attribution, whether they can be confidence in a conclusion and so forth. It really runs the gamut. It also misinforms customers. Intelligence is about a customer, right? Intelligence is not an end state in and of itself. And I think that gets lost too. This is the kind of thing that informs policymakers, that informs decision makers. And everybody, we can all understand great decisions don't come from bad information. So that relationship's pretty strong as well. But ultimately, this is kind of my own thought. Intelligence should inform or provide an information advantage to the receiving party, to that client party. That's particularly important on the national defense side, but I think it's also important from a corporate security side as well. People have CTI programs to have an information advantage, to inform their DFIR groups, to be able to educate executives and so forth on different threats. The reasons vary, but it's super important, and that information advantage becomes particularly important on the attribution analysis side. One of the problematic industry conventions I see, there's a few here. One, I've already mentioned, is this overly simplistic clustering analysis. Clustering is basically tying together different IOCs together, like a link in a sort of a link analysis format. It's a healthy activity, don't get me wrong, but I think it's also analyst made. It's not reality necessarily. It's reality as seen or evidenced by a particular analyst's insight. And that limitation built into that doesn't really get acknowledged enough. I also see a lot of weird reporting that sort of abstracts rather than acknowledges the unknowns, the known unknowns, I should say. Nobody likes to talk about what they don't know, but actually it's a very healthy analytic practice for a decision maker, for any sort of reader. I think there's a natural inclination for an author to want to sound, omniscient and all-knowing when it comes to a specific topic. The truth is rarely that. You have a set of data that you gain somehow. It's usually imperfect, and that's okay. But I think acknowledging those known unknowns is super healthy and doesn't get done enough in this industry, especially on the attribution side. The other thing that I see where I used to be on the offensive side of the house, so to speak, that worries me is we have abstracted what these threat groups are. Anybody who watched the Super Bowl and may have seen a specific vendor's advertisement that made waves, you kind of see what I'm talking about. We've turned them into supervillains and like caricatures of themselves, when in fact, especially on the espionage group, but really with any hacking group of any ilk, it's really made up of people utilizing a technology for some sort of a desired end state. That operation, a single espionage act performed with a computer, does not happen in a nutshell, especially at a state level. There are language analysts who are going to interpret that collection. There are signals development people. They're going to help with the targeting. That's going to help that actor gain access. You have the operator itself, who's on the keyboard typing away, but usually following an op plan developed by somebody that may have been developed by somebody else entirely. The list, your back-end developers that are building these tools, you have infrastructure engineers that are holding up the C2 everywhere because there's going to be redirectors everywhere, and that can't be spun up overnight. There are certain exceptions, but the more complex it is, the more they care about avoiding attribution, the more you're going to see a lot of effort and people assigned to these organizations. This all gets lost when your adversary is wearing a cowboy hat in the OK Corral. Like, that's nothing against that vendor, but that's problematic. I think that does far more harm than good. So let's start talking about some of the complex realities themselves. Custom tools are exclusive to a single actor. You have certain examples out there where whole groups are named after a particular tool itself, and it drives people nuts. You can see it on Twitter, and they're right. The truth is, though, tools, custom tools in particular, aren't necessarily closed source. Use your imagination. You have all sorts of different reasons why a espionage group might share or otherwise provide their tools, or unwittingly provide it, right? There are relationships between countries. There are intragovernmental cooperation where the civilian foreign intelligence service wants to send something to the military intelligence service, and all it took was like two people drinking the same vodka or something like that. Sometimes it can be that simple. You have situations where there is hypothesized to be a relationship between the government and the hacktivist community. China was accused of that a couple years ago, where a 0 day that was unique to a very specific group later got leaked. And when viewed in the larger context of China's military strategy in general, kind of fits the bill. All sorts of things can happen. Tools can be left behind. Artifacts left from a particular intrusion, maybe got caught by an AV. At any rate, tools rarely stay concealed indefinitely. I think that's pretty fair to say. And when you use a custom tool in your attribution analysis to link things and to join things, that can be pretty problematic. It can be a perfectly healthy, perfectly reasonable, perfectly well-evidenced analytic technique, but it's not in and of itself a guaranteed. Infrastructure decisive of attribution analysis. This is a situation where we've touched on this a little bit. Infrastructure is super important. I think it's probably the classic IOC that people have used for that sort of clustering analysis. And I think that makes sense on a certain level. It just depends on what level we're talking about. Really detailed URLs belonging to a specific group, maybe, you know what I mean? But IPs, how unique is an IP in the world of virtual private servers and things like that? The truth is, infrastructure, especially on the espionage front, but not exclusive to this at all, comes from and is sourced by all sorts of different means. You have the legitimate sort of pen test model where somebody has gone out and made a purchase on DigitalOcean and is using that to perform an attack and just masquerading as somebody or whatever. You have infrastructure that is compromised, that belongs to another country and is meant to confuse, if not misdirect, the defenders. The answer is just, it depends, right? But when you see really broad selectors being clustered together to make really high confidence attribution analysis judgments, I think you need to tread really lightly. Org structure. This is what I mean by the human component in all this, especially on the espionage side. There are whole bureaucracies that are backing up and facilitating those espionage actions. The phrase "no man is an island" kind of applies here. I mean, it doesn't mean that there couldn't be a lone wolf who's just doing it all and likes doing really, really complex infrastructure maintenance and likes to really, really. I mean, that happens. There's some unicorns out there, I'm sure, but I think in general, a lot of these government entities have a depth of people. They ultimately rely on specialization within that org to help facilitate this large, complex operation. The other thing you want to consider is how transient that can be. As soon as you bring people into the equation, there are all sorts of different dynamics, different priorities, different policies. New leadership comes in, wants to take a bite out of whatever the mission space is and put their imprint on something. All these things can affect operations. It can affect the risk tolerance of the operators themselves. If there's a new GRU chief or something like that, maybe he's got a closer relationship with his head of state, not a lesser one. And that means he's trying to impress Putin more because he's got his ear. And he's competing against the civilian foreign intelligence agency that, tends to get all the publicity and the big political espionage wins. There are all sorts of human factors that bake into this. Methodologies change. Everything is dynamic. Some recommendations. I've been poking holes or casting doubt on a lot of these conventions. Here are some recommendations. Like I've mentioned before, I think at the very beginning of this talk, the utility of attribution at all will depend on the audience. I acknowledge that. But I find that it is important to more and more people, audiences, business sectors even, than ever before. When I was doing DFIR consulting work, the first thing I did was want to know who the actor was, attribution-wise, so that we could figure out what the playbook was. What have people published on this actor that'll make my job easier, make me faster operationally to help get this network back online? So it's not just a national defense issue we're talking about. This has a lot of different applications. The gold standard for me, and everybody in this room has probably read the reports, in the past several years, the relationship with Homeland Security's CISA organization and the U.S. intelligence community has been real nice. And that was never the case when I was a government. Most books referred my agency to as being located between Baltimore and D.C. Why? It's right there. There's a sign out front, but they didn't want to. Anyway, it's a new day. To their credit, they recognize they need to be transparent. Fortunately, they are partnering with CISA. CISA's got the access that these intelligence agencies don't. The FBI might be an exception to that. They do have obviously some domestic mission, so they do have some perspective there. But there are plenty of major incidents, be they espionage, ransomware, whatever, that never get reported for a variety of reasons. But anyway, that seems to be changing. They seem to be cooperating together, and the reporting is awesome, including the attribution analysis. Something we didn't talk about a ton because it got a little complex would be the diamond model. Diamond model's a methodology that's been proposed by a member of NSA and some other people in a formal academic journal, actually. And it sort of tied together malware, infrastructure, targeting, and a few other things. Basically, this quadrant-like shape, right? And when you can tie all these things together, that's one indication. That's one way of grouping actors. I think that's good. It served the community well. I don't mean to poo-poo it. I just think we need to evolve that. And turns out I'm not alone. Timo Steffens, a German forensicator, little known, has an excellent book out there about this very topic, sort of proposes that we take that model and kind of evolve it a little bit further, right? We add some extra things, intelligence, geopolitical analysis, to sort of round the whole picture out. It spoke to me coming from the national defense side, but I think it's perfect. You know, some of the best recommendations out there aren't necessarily complex at all, and yet they get overlooked. But weighted conclusions are really important. You see this pretty regularly in the actual U.S. intelligence space. among internal reports and things like that. Sometimes in the public ones as well. But I think on the commercial side, they would benefit from using that more often and giving those things definitions up front, right? I can use all sorts of scholarly words to describe something and qualify an opinion. That's good. Now let's define what that is. Like, what does low confidence mean? What does high confidence mean? What's in between there? Then the results, the impact is infinitely better decision making, right? I mean, how many times does your supervisor and executive that you're having to consult and provide information to want to know your confidence level in something? Is every judgment the same? Of course not, right? If you have a preponderance of evidence, you're going to feel more confident about informing that party much more than if you had some sort of inkling or a rumor on Twitter or something like that. It really does matter how much evidence you have and how confident you feel in it. I mentioned the word earlier. I love order of battle. I thought I was going to be like a military analyst coming out of grad school and just study like line and block charts like this for the DIA or something. Fortunately, that never happened. But ultimately, I think you have a really good example where the Ukrainian SSB went to the trouble of demonstrating. I forget if this is Venomous Bear or one of the other bears, but it's basically a unit from the Russian FSB, not the predecessor, but the current KGB, so to speak, on the domestic side, tied a unique unit based in Vestipol that belonged to what's called Center 18, which means different things, but it's different from Center 16. I've already stepped in it. We won't go down that line. But ultimately, this is the kind of attribution, the degree of attribution that speaks to and gives confidence to well-argued attribution analysis. Threat actor behavioral economics. This is also an opinion that I can't evidence really strongly, but I've always been of the opinion of being human-driven operations, that is computer network exploitation, that every human has a potential signature, decision-wise. And I think as big data sort of gets incorporated into our lives more and more, I think there may be some credence to that. It does take a lot of data, though, to prove. But I think you will find that particular operators, as cyber espionage operators, think, behave, and ultimately operate uniquely to a degree. Aside from the tools and things like that, I know when I was in government, and I'm sitting next to the operator who's running my op, the operator mattered. They were more than a technician on the keyboard. They had a certain way of doing things that was good or bad, that I favored, and I wasn't the only one. That kind of thing really does matter. I think ultimately, if that theory got developed more, there would be a really interesting PhD dissertation at hand there. Empirical reasoning. This too gets lost in commercial attribution analysis as well in a huge way. By nature of business competition that's underlining all this commercial reporting, people are not transparent about where they source things from. And it drives me nuts. You really couldn't do that in the IC to a large degree. You had to sort of define a source of information because, again, your readership has questions. They want to know your confidence level. They're doing their own target development. But rarely do I see like, hey, we got this. We did our analysis based on this disk we found at this whacked box. And, that's where these conclusions are coming from. People don't mention that. The big guys don't mention that, sadly. And that lack of transparency, I really think, hurts how much confidence you can put in their own conclusions. here is metric shit ton of references. For anybody that wants to read it, but that's the presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Alrighty. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end our online portion. Thank you all for tuning in to MySec Jackson, and have a good evening.